Okay, calm. Gentlemen, take your time. It's not like you have this whole class of wonderful university kids waiting for you. Okay, come. No, settle down. Say sorry to the nice professor and the uni kids who will all be waiting for you.
Sorry, Stanford.
Very sorry, right? Right. So sorry that my guys are late, and hello everyone, my name is 3rd Sergeant Timothy, and today I've been called over because we'll be talking about an interesting topic about Chinese military history, Chinese weapons over time. To do this, we'll often have to explain a bit about the structure and organization, about the Chinese military at each point in time, which relates to how these weapons came about and how and why they were used. And probably mention a few things like the socio-political and cultural backdrop behind each of their use, but most of all though, we'll be looking at the weapons of ancient Imperial China and how they developed over time. Let's get into it. The Bronze Age sees the Chang rise up and replace the Neolithic clans, and the Chang are a military society. Bronze weaponry becomes one of the keys to Shang's success. We've also unearthed bronze weapons in the early Tao civilization, which preceded the Shang. And we've also have weapons at the site of Sanxingdui. It's only with the Shang that we roughly know how these weapons were used though. As a whole, bronze weapons they're part of metallurgy, which is generally a huge stepping stone for a civilization. Metallurgy requires specialists in production, turning raw materials into tools and weapons and religious items. So the Shang had bronze items as an integral part of their arsenal, both as weapons and as armor. So the main bronze weapons we can see are the halberd as well as bronze arrowheads. Now, these make the most sense. Contrary to popular belief, the battlefield was largely ruled by polearms, halberds, spears, and pikes up close. Polearms have longer reach than swords and other personal weapons. They hit harder, they're easy to produce, they're easy to get a basic level of skill at. Globally, they are the main battle weapon, the pre-modern assault rifle for about 3,000 years. And this is a weapon you could give to a commoner conscript, train him for a month or so, and reasonably expect him not to mess up. This is also a weapon that a master can make absolutely devastating. Now arrowheads are also a great choice because having your best and hardest material on arrowheads makes them penetrate far better. The issue though is that bows are hard to use. It requires a great deal of upper back strength. It requires lots of training and practice. People who master the bow either do it as a way of life, by law, as a job, or as part of society. And we see this in the Shang as well. The main experts of the bow are the Shang warrior nobility, who teach the commoner soldiers, and they also use it personally on the battlefield. So the nobles use the composite bow, which is compact, powerful, difficult to make, and an influence from some not always so friendly neighbors. We'll get to them later. Massed infantry archery is great, but another idea is the mobile archer. To move quickly, shoot, reposition, shoot again. To do that, of course, required another technological innovation, the chariot. So chariots start to come out in the Shang dynasty, and they're really this quintessential Bronze Age war technology across the globe. Whether Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mycenae, the Celts, we see chariots in lots of places around this time in history. So the use of the chariot varies from region to region, but wherever we see chariots, we need a few socio-economic conditions. One is social stratification. Chariots are expensive. You need craftsmen to work on and maintain them. You need a driver. You need farriers and stables for the horses. The warriors who use them have to be rich enough to own and maintain them and have the time needed to practice fighting on them. You need various social classes, various economic classes, and we already know the Shang have these things. And wherever you see the chariots in the ancient world, that pretty much confirms the need for social classes. So second is technology. This is a war machine. Again, you need specialists to make it and maintain it, and if you're going to use this in battle. Horses. Obviously, at the same time though, we need to look at why the chariot arose. And part of that is, in the Bronze Age and before, horses were still undergoing domestication and husbandry. In the same way that the ancient wheat had to be domesticated, so too did animals. And ancient horses were small, very small. Some historians say they're too small to be ridden at all, and that's why you have the chariot. So chariots dominate the battlefield. When chariots come in, so too do the number of professional warriors. In his reign, the Shang king Wu expands the number of professional warriors. And when the Jiao take over, they bring even more chariots into play. The ratio of chariots goes from one chariot for every 30 infantrymen to 1 chariot for every 10 infantrymen. That's a lot of chariots. The Jiao also make the chariots less ornate and more functional. Chariots are becoming more common. They really need to be used on the battlefield, and the warriors who drive them are becoming, well, there's more of them. Why? Because the Western Jiao had a lot of feudalism, and this breeds the strengthening of a warrior noble class. Exactly the people who are going to be riding these chariots. So we have these expensive war machines being driven around, used by these feudal elites who have the wealth to own and use them. The danger for them, of course, is that technology marches on, and by the end of the spring and autumn period, we see the rise of a new technology: crossbows. Crossbows are the next step in technology. They're not great over long distances, they take a longer to reload, but they are so easy to use. The bow is so powerful, it also does well against armor. Of course, the concept and mechanism are different, but by the time 650 BC rolls around, archaeologists have uncovered crossbow logs dating back to that time. So the spring and autumn period sees the rise of crossbows, and they now begin to be manufactured en masse. And with the Warring States period, we see whole regiments armed with these weapons, alongside iron weapons. So in terms of iron versus bronze, the actual functional difference in battle are pretty minimal. But what does allow iron to take off is the addition of carbon. Carbon makes iron much harder and stronger, and with the right technology, it can be made into steel. Steel weapons show up mid-warring states, and they are the game changer, as they are all around the world when they appear. Halberds, pikes, arrowheads, swords, steel. Weapons are now powerful enough that having contemporary chariots and armor aren't going to save the noble elite, especially as the commoner soldiers are being trained to form larger, more disciplined units using these steel weapons. So these common soldiers might not be able to compare individually to the warrior elite, but there are so many of them, and so many steel weapons, and chariots lose their supremacy and fall from grace. They just become more and more obsolete. They still show up ceremonially, but on the battlefield, obsolete. And they never really recover because of the next innovation that comes about, and it's also about time that we mention some of the greatest influences on China's military, for better or for worse. Now, cavalry is a kind of soldier, not really a technology, it's a kind of soldier, the kind who rides horses into battle. But at the same time, we need to talk about it because it does so much, and of course it had other pieces of technology required on it, like bridles, saddles, and eventually the stirrup. And that allows it to replace the chariot. So when last we checked, the horses are too small to be ridden into battle, but by the Warring States period, that ceases to be the case. Cavalry comes onto the scene because of bigger and better horses, all that equestrian technology we just mentioned, all the things need to keep soldiers to help them fight on horseback. So cavalry is a huge improvement on chariots. Cavalry is cheaper. You don't have to maintain the whole stupid cart. You don't have to put 2 horses on it. You can have 2 horses and 2 people on them to go off and do 2 different things. Cavalry is more mobile. You can move faster. You can make turns a lot quicker. You can go over broken ground or uneven terrain. Chariots are basically useless over anything that's not road or completely flat terrain. Cavalry, being lighter and cheaper, can be used for scouting, they can be used for skirmishing, they can be used for way more applications than just pure transportation for rich nobles or in giant pitched arranged battle on flat ground. They can be used for rapid deployment, they're tactically flexible, and because they're so mobile, mounted archers basically replace chariot archers in every regard. They're just better. There's only one thing the early cavalry can't quite do as well as chariots, and that was direct combat. Chariots offered a much more stable platform to fight on or shoot bows from. But honestly, that was fine because neither cavalry nor chariots could do that anymore against the armies of the Warring States period. Crossbows and steel weapons, you know? Now, cavalry appear in the Warring States and they carry on to the Qin and the Han dynasties. The Qin and Han dynasties continue the Warring States mass draft of huge armies, except that the cavalry department keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The reason for this comes from the people who most probably influenced the first cavalry back even in the Warring States, the Central Asian nomads. So the Xiongnu in particular were the fiercest enemy that the Qin and the Han had to deal with, and they fought in the Central Asian nomadic style, mounted archers with composite bows. Remember the composite bows that the Shang used? Most likely the Shang got it from them. The Warring States also most likely adopted the cavalry tradition from them. Sima Qian writes that they used their mobility to harass their opponents, to pry at their weaknesses, to spray them with arrows, to run them down and run away from chasing enemies. It is efficient and terrifying, and basically why the Chinese copied the idea and adopted cavalry from them. Now, Emperor Wu in the Han Dynasty hammers the Xiongnu in like a massive series of expeditions, using cavalry as his main tool. A cavalry-heavy army also makes sense as the Han Empire grows, because a cavalry army is faster. It can guard the borders better, it can move around the empire faster. And by the time the Three Kingdoms rolls around, we start to see even more cavalry. This time, armored cavalry, lots of armored cavalry, because armor has finally caught up. And having armored cavalry to take the arrows and then just smash into enemies is a massive improvement on the early concept of the chariot and pre-existing cavalry. That's why most of the great heroes of the Three Kingdoms stories are famed for wielding massive polearms and riding horses into battle, up close. Cavalry, whether light horse archers or armored mounted warriors, is now the name of the game. Through the Jin, North and South, Sui, and Tang dynasties, cavalry continues to just steamroll everybody. Technology like the stirrup essentially allows armored cavalry to surpass anything chariots could do before, and allows mounted archers to shoot more steadily than ever before. The foreign mercenaries hide in the Tang dynasty, like the Sogdians and the Gok Turks. They also make heavy use of cavalry, and who's descended from the Sogdians and Gok Turks? Anushan. And even after the Anushan rebellion and the rise of the Fanzhen, so like the regional powers, heavy cavalry rules the battlefield in China and basically all over the world. The Song see a temporary decline in the use of cavalry because they're only able to get 200,000 horses in the reign of Emperor Shenzong, where the Tang dynasty could get 700,000. But cavalry have a huge resurgence in the Yuan and Ming dynasties. This makes sense because they're built on the foundation of the Mongol military, which conquered China. However, by the time, a new weapon had emerged: gunpowder. Gunpowder burst onto the scene as a result of alchemical experiments looking for the elixir of life, which is really ironic if you think about it. Now, they had the components needed to create gunpowder for a long time, but it was the recipe that they'd had to invent. Gunpowder is honestly invented in the late Tang dynasty, but the first early recipe we have is from the early Song. So the very first appearance of gunpowder in war is the form of arrows with gunpowder incendiaries strapped on to set fire, the fiery explosions, whatever they hit. This progresses onto rockets in the Song dynasty, and then explosives and bombs before progressing on to primitive guns and hand cannons. Now, there are some immediate problems with gunpowder, and this is not just in China, all over the world when it first comes out. Before this, weapons was just a matter of metallurgy and machinery. Now we're talking like chemical engineering. And the gunpowder recipes have to be continually adjusted and modified over the years, and various kinds of refinement introduced over the centuries, and that's not even saying complex gun mechanisms, because early guns were not mechanically that complex compared to how complex making gunpowder was. So people assumed that gunpowder would produce an immediate battlefield revolution, but gunpowder's effects begin a lot more nuanced than that. Early Chinese hand cannons couldn't supplant bows on the battlefield in killing power. A skilled horse archer could actually shoot 12 arrows in a minute, whereas a hand cannon would take a minute to fire once and then reload it, and just no accuracy at all. Chinese rockets weren't accurate at all either. Of course, that doesn't matter if you're firing it at like 20 ships, but if you're trying to fire it like 10 people in a loose formation, it doesn't work so well. Where gunpowders really do shine is in the psychological effect. The noise, the flash, sheer chaos of gunpowder weapons is terrifying to humans, and especially to horses who are not used to them. And furthermore, in naval combat and in sieges, they are absolute game changers. Incendiary effects, the ability to hammer down sculptures and burst through hulls. That's where gunpowder really shines. Unfortunately, the Song aren't the only ones to pick up on it. The Mongols do as well. And the Mongols are huge specialists in horse archery, being ferocious and disciplined Central Asian nomads, like the best there was. But they also have the intelligence to get Chinese gunpowder weapons and get Chinese gunpowder specialists as military engineers. It all works out for them because they just hammer down the walls with gunpowder and then slaughter everyone inside. And the Mongols use these methods to crush the Song dynasty, essentially, and just grind them down. And then they tried out all over the world with varying degrees of success and spreading gunpowder technology across Afro-Eurasia in the process. Now, Chinese gunpowder technology continues to develop under the Yuan and the Ming dynasty. The Ming Dynasty develops cannons and they begin quartering the gunpowder, which is grinding it with water and straining it to create standardized particles with an even burn. It's here though around the 1450s that Chinese weapons development stagnates. Yep, you heard right. The Chinese invented gunpowder, but after the 1450s they began to fall behind the Europeans. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't pure stupidity. The Chinese did continue to use gunpowder, phasing out crossbows and using more handheld firearms than bows. They weren't stupid, they knew gunpowder weapons were good, but they stopped innovating. In fact, when the Tsing conquered China, they go back to a cavalry foundation. They didn't give up on gunpowder weapons as a whole, they still used lots of gunpowder, but the actual innovations made to gunpowder are minimal, and honestly, in the centuries to follow, they will be imitating contemporary European weapons. By the late Qing dynasty, the disparity in technology is so wide that the Chinese begin the self-strengthening movement in the aftermath of the Opium Wars in a bid to close the gap in military technology. Now, this is echoed all across Chinese technology, and not just the military. To this day, scholars are still undecided about why the Qing didn't have a scientific or industrial revolution at the same time as everyone else. So J.K. Fairbank points at Qing politics being hostile to the scientists, whilst Joseph Needham said it was Chinese culture, specifically Taoism, the idea that nothing can be objectively known, so the scientific method it doesn't really work. Mark Elvin suggests that China as a whole didn't need to innovate because of Qing stability. And I think, honestly, it's a combination of all these theories and a bunch of them. They all contribute. But to look specifically at the military, I'm going with Elvin's hypothesis. And the most likely hypothesis is that weapons development stagnated in Ming and Qing China, not because they thought gunpowder weapons were ineffective, because they were good enough as they were. Their opponents were defeated. They didn't need to rely on it. You asked me why. The Ming and Qing did use gunpowder. It's not like they hated gunpowder, but they never developed it to the point that it could be used as a standalone weapon, one that they would have to rely on in their armies, and in the end, they didn't even have to rely on it in the first place. The Ming, they weren't able to keep their reign despite gunpowder technology, and the Qing used gunpowder, but they didn't develop it out of a need to compete or a need to survive. They didn't need it to survive. Compare this to the spring and autumn period and the Warring States period, where crossbows, new metallurgy, cavalry all come into play. Military development technology and strategy abounded because they were not only important, they were incredibly competitive, and they were a matter of survival. And in the West, that is exactly what happens. 30 Years' War, Napoleonic War, even the Renaissance back in the 1450s and the 1500s, they have to undergo several military and economic revolutions, and this generates immense pressure to rapidly develop better engineering, better ships, better tactics, better guns to survive. So by the time Victoria is crowned Queen of the United Kingdom, 400 years of war have completely transformed the European powers. By the time the Opium Wars come around, Chinese military technology is obsolete. So, what is there to learn from all this? Well, we've looked at bronze weapons, at chariots, at gun crossbows and steel, at cavalry, and at gunpowder. What can we learn? Honestly, none of these weapons replaced each other immediately. Early iron wasn't better than bronze, early cavalry alone couldn't supplant chariots, and early gunpowder was useful, but it didn't replace the other weapons. What's key is that when iron first appeared, its technological capacity was untapped. It was at the bottom of its own technological tree. Early horsemen were only scratching the surface of what cavalry could do. And the first guns might not be as lethal as a skilled archer, but look at a modern assault rifle. The most potent tools of tomorrow may seem insignificant compared to the best tools of today, because they have yet to reveal their potential. So, first of all, keep innovating. Both for technology and yourself, never stop pushing the limits of new ideas. Never stop challenging yourself and making full use of your abilities to improve. Put yourself into environments where you can really grow and improve. Number 2, never dismiss your unique gifts and passions. You might have hobbies and passions and skills which don't seem useful right now, especially according to Singapore's meritocratic system, but don't be afraid to see them develop to their full potential. And number 3, keep an eye out. Recognize things which have lots of unrealized potential and invest in them. That's all for me. Thank you.